When someone says the Stone Wall, most of us who are Civil War enthusiasts think of that wall by the sunken road at Marie's Heights in Fredericksburg. But what if I said Stonewall? Then most of us who are Civil War buffs would think about General Thomas Jonathan Jackson and his exploits as a warrior during the American Civil War. But how much do you really know about the man? There are many stories that reveal a lot about the personality of General Jackson. So stay with us as we present Stories of Stonewall here on this episode of History Scene.
It may not be the biggest, it's just a little show with stories of Virginia and places you may know. It's about the times and faces that made us who we are. We'll take you to those places, we'll travel near and far. We have history around every tree. We have old-time tales to hear and see. Our past will come alive again on your TV screen, while having fun with good old friends here on History Scene, where all the places and faces are traces of history. You'll see us then, you'll see us now, here on History Scene. History.
Here in the Rappahannock River region of Virginia, it's easy to talk about the military exploits of General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. I'm actually standing on the Tally Farm Ridge where an Ohio brigade made a last stand against Jackson's famous flank attack when his 2nd Corps routed the Union 11th Corps during the Battle of Chancellorsville. The attack erupted, and that's the word, from the ridge that you see over my shoulder. That attack was Jackson's finest military moment. But several hours later, a couple of miles in that direction, it was his worst moment as he was wounded, mortally wounded, by friendly fire. But this show is about Thomas Jackson, the man. He had an unusual personality. And to help us explore that personality, I'm joined today by our executive producer, Tom Van Winkle. I call him Bear. Bear, I think you are an admirer of General Thomas Jackson, right?
I do find the man fascinating, and I certainly admire his military skills, but I really would like to understand better his somewhat quirky personality.
Now, I think you're familiar with Professor James Robertson's book, Stonewall Jackson, the Man, the Soldier, the Legend, but that starts with a great observation about 3 books in the Jackson bookcase at the Virginia Historical Society.
Yes, Scott, it's like his persona is captured by those 3 books sitting there side by side. On the left, you had the Holy Bible. In the center was John Gibbon's The Artillerist Manual. And on the right was Philip Bennett Powers' I Will, being the determination of the man of God. It's like a personality snapshot of Thomas Jonathan Jackson. It's a man of arms surrounded by the tenets of faith.
Earlier you used the word quirky, talking about his personality. Now imagine a lot of that was formed by experiences he had in his youth. And now through some video magic, we're in Jackson's Mill, West Virginia. We've come a long ways. There's the mill behind us, the river, across the river, the poplar trees. Young Thomas Jackson did a lot of growing up right around here.
Yes, he did. And when you look at his childhood, it's very surprising he could even function. Imagine being born in Appalachia into deep family poverty. Your older sister and your dad die when you're 2 years old. You, a younger sister, and mom become so destitute that you have to live in a 12-foot square shack on an alley given to you as charity by the local Masonic Lodge. You have 1 shirt, 1 pair of raggedy pants. Your mom wallows in her grief and misery. Then, when you are 6 years old, your mom marries another impoverished man who abuses you and your sister. And then, by the age of 7, your mom dies and you're shipped here to live with your uncle.
But now life here with his uncle was a little better, wasn't it?
Well, it was a little better, but it was still a lot of hard work. And young Thomas was said to be very intense and sad. Whenever he had an opportunity, he would cross the river on his raft to a stand of white poplars and sugar maples. It was the lonely boy's favorite place, and he would spend hours there with only his thoughts.
But yet he had the determination to look for educational opportunities.
Yes, he did, but it was kind of piecemeal, and young Thomas wasn't the greatest scholar, but he worked hard under his tutors here just outside of Weston.
Well, we've come in out of the cold and we're inside one of the mills here on the property. But isn't it rather surprising that Jackson got selected into West Point?
Well, he wasn't really selected. In fact, the guy who was selected before him dropped out before the fall semester. And it took some pretty encouraging words to his local congressman to get him in. Now, he did pass the exam for entrance, but he was last in that, but he did get in.
So what can we learn about Thomas J. Jackson's personality from his time at West Point?
West Point was probably the greatest challenge of his life. There is a lot written about it, but rigid is perhaps the best single word to describe the young man. He was both emotionally and physically rigid. He was so poorly prepared for the academic rigors of West Point that he focused solely on getting through it all. He didn't cultivate friendships, engage in social events, or play pranks. His dedication to his academic duty was absolute.
Now, what do you mean by physically awkward?
Well, he was actually comically awkward. He was very much the butt of the jokes of the other cadets, and it seemed like he was so inwardly focused that he couldn't move. In fact, when he would walk or ride a horse, it always seemed like he was going to fall forward. In artillery class, he was so bumbling that his instructor would scream at him just out of frustration.
But it was that intense focus that allowed him to succeed in spite of his shortcomings in early education and talent.
That's true, but he took that to the extreme. At one point in his furlough between his junior and senior year, he put on a brand new cadet uniform to go to church with his family one Sunday. Well, on the way to church, his horse bucked him on a river near here, threw him into 3 feet of water. Well, his family assumed that he was going to go home and change into dry clothes, but he didn't. Because young Stonewall said it would be unacceptable to be late for church, and he showed up as a very wet and dripping cadet.
Yet he did graduate, and he served with honor in the Mexican War, right?
That's correct. In fact, Lieutenant Jackson was in the 1st U.S. Artillery. And this is the point where we start to see his field tactics early on in his career. Jackson was given 3 field promotions, and that was more than any other officer. And at one point, he disobeyed an order to withdraw. But that turned out to be the correct call. And it kind of shows you what Jackson felt was his duty as he saw it.
Okay. After the Mexican War, he became an instructor at Virginia Military Institute. But that didn't go too well, did it?
Well, that depends on how you look at it. On one hand, his teachings on discipline, mobility, military intelligence, and joint operations were of such quality, they're still given at VMI today. On the other hand, he didn't really have the ability to explain things in a variety of ways. He would memorize a lecture, give it, and if a cadet had a question, he would just back up and re-recite that part of the lecture again. He wasn't very well respected by the students in the academic area. In fact, in 1856, a group of alumni tried to have him removed.
Now, in the interest of time, let's fast forward through Jackson's early Civil War career. Of course, there was First Manassas. It was there that his coolness under fire and commitment to duty earned him his Stonewall nickname. And his mastery of speed and maneuver, learned well at West Point from lessons regarding Napoleon Bonaparte's tactics, made him a legend during his Shenandoah Valley campaign. And before you know it, it's December of 1862, and Stonewall is hot-footing it from the Shenandoah Valley to here at Fairfield Plantation, south of Fredericksburg, at Guinea Station.
That's right, Scott, and we can take a look at Stonewall's last 3 months or so of his life here in the Rappahannock region.
Well, Bear, go for it.
Well, just before the march, Stonewall was promoted to Lieutenant General, which is a fact that he did not put in his letters to his wife, Anna. In fact, his wife, Anna, and he were expecting at that time, and that was pretty much the focus of his letters back and forth. Stonewall didn't tell anybody at all around him that they were expecting. And actually, Anna gave birth during that march, and Stonewall didn't tell anyone.
Well, what can we conclude from that story?
Well, Scott, Stonewall kept his life very rigid and structured.
Okay, compartmentalized.
Exactly, and that story is completely consistent with his personality. His visions were in order: family, religion, and duty to country. But he kept those things very separated. In fact, in his letters to Anna, he would only speak of family and religious type things.
All right, so that's that side of things. What about with military things?
Well, with military and his subordinates, he expected high moral fiber and obedience to his requests. And if he didn't get that, he was known to sometimes harshly punish some of his subordinates. But if that punishment was going to get into or in the way of a battle, he was known to make some exceptions.
So Jackson arrives here at the Chandler farm, and almost immediately the Federal Army starts to mass for a river crossing at Fredericksburg.
That's right, Scott. General Jackson was responsible for the defense south of Fredericksburg. And then he began consolidating his corps and moved his headquarters to a farm a couple miles south of Hamilton's Crossing and Prospect Hill. Well, Scott, we can gain a little more understanding of Stonewall if we take a little trip. I like to go out to Prospect Hill, but I do want to stop at Lee's Hill first, because there's a great little story there that we can understand a little bit more about Stonewall's persona.
Okay, let's go to both those places. It was from this position that General Lee commanded his army during the Battle of Fredericksburg. And Jackson arrived here early in the morning of the main day of the battle, right?
He certainly did, Scott, and he knew there was going to be a big fight. But his pride of fatherhood, his confidence in victory, and total faith in God put him what his engineer and chief mapmaker, Lieutenant Colonel Hotchkiss, called his most serene and cheerful mood. In fact, he dressed that morning to reflect that mood. He put on a brand new full uniform and cap trimmed with gold braid. A new saber, boots, and spurs completed that outfit.
Whoa, now that's not the General Jackson I know. He was known for his rather slovenly appearance.
Absolutely, Scott, and you can imagine what the troops would have thought when they saw his new uniform. But he really didn't catch all the teasing until he came right here to meet with Lee.
What happened?
Well, Generals Stuart and Longstreet were already here by the time Jackson arrived. And as Jackson dismounted his horse, Stuart made some good-natured comments about his uniform. But knowing that Stuart had given Jackson that uniform, one of Stuart's aides on his staff complimented the general about his uniform. And Jackson, sort of blushing, turned around and said, well, my friend Stuart may have something to do with this. But during the morning's discussion about the battle for the day, General Longstreet made an unsuccessful attempt at humor. He actually turned to Jackson and said, are you not afraid of that file of Yankees down there before you? And Jackson turned and said, well, let them get a little closer. And they will either scare me or I will scare them.
Wait a minute, Longstreet tried to be funny?
Yeah, but that wasn't it. At the end of the war council, Longstreet tried again. And as Jackson mounted his horse Little Sorrel, Longstreet turned and said to him, but sir, what will you do with those people down there? And Jackson turned to him in a stern voice and said, well, sir, we'll give them the bayonet. And then Jackson rode off to his lines.
Well, that's another side of the personality of Stonewall. He didn't think anything that had to do with military matters was funny. Now, let's go to Prospect Hill.
Okay.
Well, Bear, what can we learn about Stonewall the Man from the Battle of Fredericksburg?
Well, Scott, one thing is that Jackson was always the type to want to be on the offensive. He wanted to attack the Federals. But General Lee had decided that defense would be the order of the day. So Jackson, understanding that, took his orders, and he designed a stacked defense that would actually repel a Union breakthrough, which was right behind us for a time.
So following that battle, you get to the winter of 1862-63, right before the Chancellorsville campaign, and Jackson spends the winter at Moss Neck Plantation on down the river.
That's right, Scott, and there are a couple of pretty good stories and anecdotes from there.
Well, now, what's your favorite one, Bear?
Well, Scott, I think I'd have to pick the story of little Janie Corbin. She was the beautiful 6-year-old daughter of the host of Moss Neck. And little Janie and Stonewall had gotten to be very, very close. Little Janie would run out to the outbuilding on the Moss Neck property that Jackson used as his headquarters. In fact, she'd run out there nearly every day. And at one point, Jackson had received a new hat from his wife, Ann, and he had cut the decorative band off that hat and given it to Janie, and she wore it as a crown. In fact, she would wear it everywhere. But come mid-March, Jackson had to go up to his new headquarters, which was at Hamilton's Crossing, which is just off to the right in front of us here. And the day after he got there, he received a letter, and unfortunately in that letter it stated that when he had left, little Janie was fighting scarlet fever, and she had succumbed to it, she didn't make it, and she had died. And it was said that Jackson had just broke down in tears and just fell to his knees in prayer right in front of his staff.
That's an amazing story. Now that pushes us on into April as we build up to the Battle of Chancellorsville, but let's go to the intersection of Furnace Road and the Orange Plank Road and talk about how the battle evolved from there.
Let's do that.
Bear, this section of the Orange Plank Road and Furnace Roads in Spotsylvania County has huge significance in our local Civil War history.
That's right, Scott. The planning by Lee and Jackson for the famous flank attack occurred right here, on this corner of the intersection. Their very last meeting was also here on the morning of May 2nd, 1863.
And how did these meetings show his personality?
Well, the planning meeting was a long one, but the bottom line was that Lee proposed to duplicate the strategy that worked so well at the Second Battle of Manassas, a long, sweeping march led by Jackson, culminating in a flank attack.
Now let's talk about that a minute. Hooker's army outnumbers Lee almost 3-1. Lee has left General Early back in Fredericksburg with an entire division as a rear guard. And now Lee's planning to divide his army again? That wasn't 19th century military doctrine.
But that was a Napoleonic style, and that tells a lot about the personalities of Lee and Jackson. In fact, Lee felt that his army was already in such peril that by doing something kind of wild and crazy, it really reduced the risk. And since Jackson was always wanting to attack, Lee would go all in if he thought he had a winning hand.
Then Stonewall got his corps together and they marched right through this intersection, right?
That's right. And that was the last meeting of Lee and Jackson. Those who witnessed it said that the battle fire was raging in Jackson's eyes. He and General Lee spoke briefly, then Jackson turned his horse, Little Sorrel, and rode to the west.
And to the best and worst of destinies all in a single day. Let's go over to the flank attack site.
Okay.
Well, Bear, we're in the general area where the Confederate Army 2nd Corps came bursting out of the woods from behind us, headed that way, and completely surprised, then routed the Union Army's 11th Corps.
That's right, Scott. And that's perhaps the most famous flank attack during the Civil War. And this is where we start to see the detail-oriented professional soldier in Stonewall Jackson. Now, when he realized the position of the Union right, somewhere around 2 p.m., he knew that he had to march his corps several hours further so that he could attack around the end of that flank rather than the middle of it. But even in the midst of all this, he still took time to report to his boss. In fact, that would be the last message he ever sent, and that was somewhere around 3 p.m. And that was to General Lee. And in that message he said, "The leading division is up, and the next two appear to be well closed."
Now, as that attack time approached, more of that professional soldier that you talked about emerged.
In fact, just before the attack, old Jack looked around at his battle staff and he saw some very familiar faces from the Virginia Military Institute. His old students were now division, brigade, and regimental commanders. So it was with great emotion that he yelled out, "The Institute will be heard from today." And then with his orders, the attack began.
And that's when General Jackson's corps chased General Howard's corps into the wilderness and into the night. Let's go over to where that chase ended for General Jackson. So the Confederate 2nd Corps pushes the Federal Army 2 miles to the east, encouraged by General Jackson. And by 9 p.m., we wind up here in the middle of this thick second-growth forest, the wilderness.
That's right, Scott. And those things, combined with the nature of Jackson being the hard-charging warrior, contributed to a disaster for the Confederacy. Jackson was focused on continuing the attack, and he decided to ride out here with his staff to do his own reconnaissance, and he basically walked right into the fire of his own people. And in the underbrush, in the dark, that group of mounted horsemen approaching the Confederate skirmish line were judged to be Federals. And in that hail of rifle fire, Captain Keith Boswell and 3 of Jackson's staff couriers were killed by the friendly fire, and General Jackson was wounded himself.
So how did Stonewall react to his wounding?
Well, Scott, his reaction was totally predictable. The foremost aspect of his persona, his military professionalism, really took over. He was calm, and he did everything he could to minimize the impact of his wounding. When he was still up on Little Sorrel, a staff member said to him, "General, it is most remarkable that any of us escaped." Then another aspect of his personality came forth. He said, yes, it's providential, because he also looked at things, including this calamity, as the will of God.
Then came the very difficult evacuation back to the Confederate field hospital, right?
That's right, Scott. It was very difficult. When the general couldn't ride any longer, he walked a bit. But then they brought up some litter bearers and put the general on a litter. But they came under very intense fire, artillery fire actually, and they dropped the general twice. Now, all of this weakened him tremendously. But he made it clear that he wanted to be under the care of his longtime friend, Dr. Hunter McGuire. And he wanted to have that done back at the Confederate Field Hospital, which was positioned back to our west of the wilderness. And in kind of a departure from his normal ways of not having any liquor, he did ask for spirits a couple of times.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, the litter bearers finished their work, and he was put in a wagon and taken to that field hospital. Let's go to that site. Now, the ruin behind me is part of a building that was a dependency at the Wilderness Tavern. The Confederate Field Hospital was across modern Route 3 in the field in the distance. Now, Bear, Stonewall must not have felt very good by the time he got here.
No, he wasn't, Scott. And it was 11 p.m. by the time the wagon carrying the general arrived. And by 3 a.m. on May 3rd, the amputation of his left arm was completed. And all seemed to be going pretty well at first.
But about an hour later, Jackson's aide, that's Major Sandy Pendleton, showed up, and it might have looked like the old warrior was losing some of his fight. Now, Pendleton had been sent by General Jeb Stuart, who of course had command, at this point, of the 2nd Corps. Stuart was trying to get Jackson's guidance on what to do next.
Yes, but when asked, Stonewall couldn't concentrate. For a brief moment, his nostrils flared and his eyes flashed that warrior's fire. But then his lips quivered, his body sunk back into the bed. Sadly and feebly, he said, "I don't know, I can't tell. Say to General Stuart that he must do what he thinks is best."
I believe that after Pendleton left, Jackson had another visitor, this one from his chaplain, the Reverend Beverly Tucker Lacey.
Yes, this chaplain was very upset by Stonewall's condition, but Jackson consoled Lacey. He expressed his belief that my Heavenly Father designs this affliction for my good. He also stated that while the flank march may have been his most successful military movement of his life, he feared that he would be given too much credit for something that was the providence of God. And by the way, when he left, Reverend Lacey carried General Jackson's arm over to his brother's farm, J. Horace Lacey's, also known as Elwood, and he buried it. And there is a stone marking it in that spot today, the only stone in the entire graveyard.
So once again, we've got the quintessential Stonewall Jackson, a man concerned about both his faith and his military profession. But now we have Lee sending a message ordering Jackson moved to Guinea Station.
Yes, that's correct, but the general, he really resisted that at first. But when Sedgwick's wing began marching west from Fredericksburg, General Lee actually ordered that Hunter McGuire accompany Jackson to Guinea Station. In fact, why don't we make that 27-mile trip right now?
Let's do that. Well, Bear, we've made a circle. We've come back to Guinea Station, and we're here at the Chandler Plantation.
Well, sadly we are, Scott, but let's take a walk in the house and take a look at where Jackson spent the last 6 days of his life.
All right, I'd like that. So this is the bedroom. where Jackson died, and you said that some of these furnishings were the ones that were actually here when that happened.
That's correct, Scott. The fireplace mantle you see here was original. The Ingram clock with that ominous ticking was the last thing Jackson ever heard as original. And of course, behind us is the actual bed that Jackson died in. And that includes the blanket that's laid on the bed right here.
Amazing. I almost feel like I'm intruding. But tell me, did Jackson's persona change any?
Not a bit. In fact, I'll give you a couple examples of that. It started the moment he arrived here on Monday, the evening of May 4th. As he was carried into the yard, he apologized to the owner of Fairfield Plantation, Thomas Chandler, for not being able to shake his hands. We sometimes forget that Stonewall was also wounded in his right hand, but he was always professional in his demeanor. Jackson seemed to be doing pretty well through the next day. And he in fact had a very long and deep religious discussion with one of his aides, James Power Smith. But during a nap, he began to cry out, "Major Pendleton, send in. See if there's higher ground behind Chancellorsville."
That sort of was letting us know some things to come, I guess. But now, what about that other side of Jackson, his family? What about Anna, his daughter Julia?
Well, it was Tuesday evening before they really even get back into this story. You see, the Union cavalry had torn up the RF&P Railroad between Guinea Station and Richmond. And Anna's brother, Joseph Morrison, was dispatched from Guinea Station to go get Anna and Julia down in Richmond. But he didn't even make it there until Tuesday evening.
When did they get here?
Well, not until Thursday at noon. Anna didn't get to see Stonewall until he took a turn for the worse. And Dr. McGuire came to believe Jackson is actually developing pneumonia.
How did it go when Anna first saw him?
Well, not well. When Anna leaned over to kiss him, Stonewall did manage to look at her and say, "I'm very glad to see you looking so bright." But then he lost consciousness. And Anna later wrote that he looked like a dying man.
Well, things went downhill fast after that.
Yes, they did. Stonewall began to realize that he didn't have much more time left. But he really reassured everybody around him that he was fine with God's will. At one point, he asked to see Chaplain Lacey. The old warrior charged his chaplain with promoting better observance of the Sabbath in the Army. And when Chaplain Lacey asked Jackson if he should come into Jackson's room the next morning for worship service, Stonewall insisted that he was most needed to preach to the Second Corps soldiers.
And then came the fateful Sunday.
Sadly, it did. Dr. McGuire informed Anna, and then Stonewall himself, that death was at hand. As was a custom in those days, Anna brought his daughter Julia to him. Julia brought a smile to his face, and he greeted her warmly. Anna wrote that he then closed his eyes as if committing her to God. While he was unconscious and delirious most of the day, he did manage to say at one point, "This is the Lord's day. My wish is fulfilled. I have always desired to die on Sunday."
And at the end?
Well, he went into a deep coma, and a very interesting thing happened. He began narrating the dreams he was having in that coma, and they began going backwards in time at a very rapid pace. They began at Chancellorsville with him giving orders to Major Pendleton. Then he saw himself leading the army of the living God. He regressed back through his battles in the Civil War and the Mexican War. He saw himself at West Point, but then he paused. He had arrived at his boyhood home at Jackson's Mill on the West Fork River. With serenity, his final words were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees."